All right, hey guys, I'm back with another review. I've been on my Jasmine Guillory kick lately, and so this book is The Proposal. Um, it's not my first Jasmine Guillory book that I read. I think the very first book that I read from her is By the Book. Oh yes, that review is coming next. Okay, yeah, more to come for that review. But right now, I'm going to try to focus on the Proposal review. Okay, so the book, I would just say overall is just really like low tension, low stakes, just really an easy read. And if you're a mood reader like myself, you definitely want to make sure that the books that you're reading aren't going to, intensify your mood in a negative way. If you're not up for certain reads, so definitely gauge the stories that you're reading, and if you're a mood reader. And this book is definitely one of those books where, if no matter what kind of day you're having, because this book is just like such an easy book to get through. It's not one of those books where you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not mentally prepared to read. So it's super cute. So we start with the book focuses on Nick and Carlos Ibarra. So first we meet Nick, and she is at a baseball game. I believe they live in the Bay Area, in California. Jasmine Guillory, the author herself, I do believe that she is from California. At least she went to college there. So I get the settings from a lot of her books. I read three of her books so far. So all those settings have been in California. Okay, so we meet Nick. She's at a Dodgers game on a phone, not having fun with her then boyfriend. I guess it's this. She makes it known that he's like this really hot white guy who's like, trying to get into the acting scene. He's done a few things. It's her birthday. Nick is actually a freelance writer, and so she is there, not having the best time of her life. So she sits there. I want to say she was at the baseball game for her then boyfriend's birthday. So he invited a lot of his friends there. It was pretty much all his friends and her. So I guess the baseball game pauses, and he ends up proposing to her. She's on the screen, and he proposes to her, and she's like, hey, are you sure you want to do this now? And he's kind of like, what are you talking about? So as the reader, you're kind of like, trying to figure out, why is it that Nick is not really too interested in, at least saving face. It's almost like, why couldn't you just have said yes, and then maybe once your face is no longer plastered on the humongous screen at the stadium, maybe you'll talk to him behind closed doors and say, hey, I don't think we should get married. But that's not what happened. She, tries to tell him, look, this is not a good idea. We shouldn't be doing this. I definitely don't want to do this. So she tells him that. We find out, a little bit throughout the time that, she kind of really just was not as into the relationship as maybe, she had the sense that he wasn't into the relationship, like getting too serious. She was under the impression he had the same feelings, but apparently she was wrong, because he ends up proposing to her, and she's like confused. She was like, okay, I guess I didn't know that this is something, that he wants to do. So she ends up saying no. And so the then boyfriend, I forget his name, gets really upset, and he's so embarrassed throughout the thing. So then throughout the game, so I believe him and his friends leave. They leave her, and she's like at the stadium, like still sitting down, and she's like, okay, there were my ride there, and why did he have to go and do this? So a couple of cameras come to her, and then we get introduced to Carlos Ibarra, who's there with his sister, whom he's really close to. And he sees Nick, because he saw when she was being proposed to. And he's noticed that some cameras were going back up to her to figure out, why she said no and to get more tea out of the story. So Carlos and his sister end up, keep in mind this is a rom-com, very low stakes, and yeah, just keep that in mind. Him and his sister end up going up to Nick and, coming up with some kind of, story in front of the cameras in order to keep her from being harassed by them about like how she's a family member and it's, time for them to go. So she buys into it, and she plays along with them, and she, escapes the cameras. So she ends up leaving with Carlos and Carlos's sister. So after they leave, I believe he drops her off at her house. I believe he drops her off at her house, and she is getting, text messages from her ex. He's calling her all these sorts of names, and she's like super unhappy, super uncomfortable, and about the text messages and stuff. So Carlos and his sister end up dropping her off, and then, there's that. I think they ended up exchanging, so they end up talking in the car, and she finds out that Carlos is a doctor. Carlos, the sister, and Nick are all in the car, and they're talking, and she ends up finding out, he's a doctor and where he works and what he does. That's important because it makes sense as to how they end up reconnecting again. So I think that she ends up, Nick, right after the game, she ends up like telling Carlos and the sister, hey, let me treat you guys to like, one of my favorite places. My friends are going to be there. Just come along with me. So Carlos and his sister end up going along with Nick. And they go to like this restaurant, and Nick is there, and Nick meets her other friends at the restaurant, and they're like, all having a chat about what happened at the stadium and how terrible, Nick, felt for being put on the spot and then having to say no to the ex that she was even shocked that was interested in possibly getting, married. So she starts talking about, they eat and they drink a little bit. And Carlos and his sister seem to be enjoying Nick and her friends. So they eat and they talk. And then essentially Nick starts to talk about, the text messages that she's been getting in the car from her ex. And then we notice like Carlos gets a little bit uncomfortable, and he ends up saying, hey, we got to go. So him and his sister leave, and, Nick is sad to see them go. So Nick ends up going home, and thus, sort of thinking about what happened with the event, and just like also, just trying to figure out, how can I, really thank, Carlos and his sister for what they did, and also what can I do, because she's like scared that the ex is going to like, follow her and like wreak havoc and cause some sort of domestic abuse against her. So she ends up enrolling. So this is like a secondary plot in the story where she ends up enrolling in a women's self-defense course. So she does that with her friends. One of her friends, I want to say one of them is a model, but the other one owns like a cupcake business. So they all three join the women's self-defense course, what have you. So Nick is still thinking about Carlos because her friends were like talking about him and how, cute he is and stuff like that, and how he's a doctor, this and that. And I want to say that Nick did once date a guy before she dated this guy that proposed to her. She kind of had some, leftover trauma from that past relationship where she felt like, that guy was just not in support of her. He just really wasn't a good guy, made her feel like her writing was terrible and really lowered her self-esteem. So I think that guy was a doctor as well. So she's kind of like, not really interested in dating another doctor. But she does end up reaching out to Carlos because she finds out he works for like this like community health center, and she ends up like finding his email address online and like emails him and stuff. And then Carlos ends up, responding, and they figure out a time and a place to meet up again. So Carlos's backstory is that Carlos, you can tell, or he explains that he is the type of person who like really loves to help people, even to his own detriment. He had his father died a few years ago, and he just always has wanted to be present for his sister and his mom and his aunt and his cousin who is married, but she ends up being pregnant, and I think she gets diagnosed with she ends up having issues with her pregnancy, and she had to be like on bed rest. And since Carlos is a pediatrician, he ends up, working with her and making sure that his cousin, is on the right track and gets seen by the best doctors and all that stuff. So he ends up hanging out with Nick, and he actually does find Nick attractive. I believe, like, since they were, at that first hangout with Nick and her friends, he always thought she was attractive. So they end up hanging out. They go to eat at some like, like restaurant that's kind of like a hole in the wall. And, they find out more about each other, and they end up finding out that they're foodies and stuff like that. So they do have a lot of chemistry. Even as a reader, you can tell, you can sense the sexual tension coming from the page, and you can tell that they actually do have, chemistry. You can just tell. And so he finds her attractive, she finds him attractive, and they go back to her place after the hole in the wall restaurant that they go to. She ends up, kind of asking him to come to her house and check it, just in the event that, her ex-boyfriend is there, and he goes there and he checks it out for her. She ends up, serving him up some wine, and they end up, spending the night together, and thus from there, they end up starting sort of like a friends with benefits relationship. And so it's when I tell you, it's like very like low stakes. You're as a reader, you're like enjoying, the beginning stages of a relationship, essentially. So they are, doing the friends with benefits. They're talking to each other, emailing each other, texting each other, and, just getting to know each other, slowly. Like, there's no rush. You don't feel, no one is playing a game. It doesn't seem like she's playing games with him. He doesn't seem like he's playing games. He's definitely interested in just being friends with benefits, and they both agree with that. Nick is very staunch on it. So her friend ended up having like a disaster at her restaurant, and Carlos ends up being able to go and help her, to help Nick and the friend. And it was just like, Nick just really feels like, he's really thoughtful and stuff. So you do see their, friendship and their relationship blossoms. I would definitely say like the most awkward part is, so they start to hang out, Nick and Ibarra, a lot Carlos a borrow a lot. So in one instance, the date actually ends up being at Carlos's house, and he's cooking for her. I want to say like these, empanadas. He's making special empanadas for his cousin. And so, because he wants her to have something to be able to eat for when she gives birth. So, Nick goes to his kitchen, goes to his house and helps him cook and does all the things, right? So they're having fun. They have a ton of banter in the kitchen and just, have lots of laughs. And then Carlos gets a call that his, cousin had a medical emergency. And so Carlos is still cooking the food. So he asked Nick, and at this point, they're like, closer friends. He asked her, hey, can you stay in the house and watch the food? Something happened with, my cousin and stuff, so I need to go to the hospital. So Nick is like, oh, yeah, no, that's fine. So she ends up staying at his house and then, watching the food. And then the food ends up being done. This part was, like, kind of awkward because it just kind of was like, like, why, I guess. So Nick is, like, texting Carlos. She's like, are you okay? He's like, yeah, we're okay. We're all kind of hungry. So Nick ends up, even though she's, like, not really, like, the most, nurturing, type, at least in a relationship, packing up some of the empanadas and going to the hospital to meet, with Carlos's family. So she ends up doing it thinking that she's doing it out of the goodness of her heart. But then Carlos ends up feeling like extra, like she goes there and Carlos is like so shocked that he like kind of like ignores her, making her feel like so awkward, so embarrassed. And his family's like, who is this? And he's just like, oh, she's a friend. And he kind of like doesn't really talk to her while they're in the waiting room. And like Nick like totally regrets trying to have a good heart and, taking the stuff there. It was super awkward. So she ends up leaving, and I think they end up hanging out after that. And then Carlos ends up, Carlos and Nick end up meeting back together and then, doing what friends with benefits do. And so after, that whole event and stuff, Carlos ends up saying, he thinks that he loves her. Yeah, he said, I love you. And, it's like, hey, I don't want to do the friends with benefits. I actually, like want to be in a relationship with you. And, surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, depending on the stance that you've been taking as a reader this entire time, Nick is like, no, you're just saying that. This is not true. And she like literally tries to convince the guy that he actually does not like her. He doesn't want to be in a relationship. I would say definitely as a reader, that part kind of annoyed me because I'm like, girl, he said he really likes you. Like, he's a doctor. He's well put together. Yeah, he's got some like fatherhood trauma, but he's not like a playboy or he's not for the streets. So I'm confused as to why you won't date him. So, Carlos gets, embarrassed and is obviously hurt that she doesn't, reciprocate the feelings. So then we go, through the third act breakup, of course. And, Nick ends up realizing with her and her friends that, after not really talking to Carlos throughout the time after he said he loved her, to give him some time to, heal, she hasn't been talking to him. And she finally, Nick, just one day decides, oh my gosh, I think I'm actually